really increase stakeholder engagement. And with that, I'd like to refer particularly to the Southern Environmental Association experience as a partner with Compact. Really, we have a very long history with Compact in that we have partnered with them since the inception, and they have really allowed the organization to grow from one that was a purely volunteer-based organization to one that now manages 2 of the sites that constitute Belize's World Heritage. They've allowed us to establish site management. They've created, through our partnership with Compact, we've been able to really create that stakeholder awareness of the importance of our Barrier Reef Reserve system. We've been able to provide training, in particular to fishing, the fishing sector, in alternative livelihood activities that really focuses on tourism, and to build a cadre of field educators. Compact support to see really, and this is really, I only have a couple slides more. Compact support to see has really allowed us to engage local communities in meaningful protected areas management. And really what I want to highlight today is that we've been able, through Compact support, to really engage fishers in the establishment of increasing the size of our no-take zones within marine reserves, which really is groundbreaking for us, where we've had meaningful consultations. We've been able to gather data from these fishing stakeholders as to what areas are priority areas for them, which areas should be fully protected, being able to map those areas along with their input, and really start the discussion on what are realistic, feasible economic alternatives for these groups that will be directly impacted by the expansion. And with that, I really want to just end with one key message, is that Compact has allowed us to build institutional capacity of local site managers, but has really allowed us to engage and build community stewardship of these protected areas.
Thank you, Bill. It's my task to just wrap up with a few lessons learned. So now how do I, okay. So one of the, I think that there are many lessons that can be distilled from a decade of work such as this in so many regions. So I will just go through briefly some of the key ones that we've identified. But one is the value of taking a landscape approach, and one in which diverse stakeholders and communities are brought in. Another aspect of Compact that I think is unique and very relevant to other sites, and Terence spoke to this, is this dynamic between being, on the one hand, quite strategic, rooted in science, and we've added culture because that's true too in how it's implemented on the ground. It's guided by strategic planning, but it's at the same time highly participatory. Each of these programs has really emerged from the ground up and been shaped by the local people, and therefore is really relevant to the local context. And Compact understands the power of synergy, that when you support a cluster of different kinds of activities, not just grants, but capacity building, networking, exchanges, support with marketing, you can have a bigger impact. Now, what do I do? There we go. And actually, I lost a slide here, sorry. Compact is a child of the SGP and is very much shaped by SGP's way of working, and SGP has a long track record and experience in approaches that are based on the principle of sharing power. SGP, I think, as a grant-making agency, really understands how to work with communities and the patience that's required, the need for transparent processes and broad public participation. And as again you saw in Terence's short presentation, they have set up structures such as the advisory bodies in order to do that, in order to get that kind of input. And this approach, this model and this decade of experience on the ground is highly scalable. It's highly relevant to other settings. All kinds of protected areas, not just World Heritage, all kinds of governance types. But one of the lessons learned is the idea that when you keep your lessons close to the protected area, you can track what is happening over time, but then you can build outward from the World Heritage Site to the local, the national, and the regional levels. And again, back to the participatory structure, having local coordinators and local consultative bodies really help to facilitate community involvement and build capacity for conservation. So we were asked to, I don't know what quite happened to this heading, but we were asked to give some input, as Harold also did so effectively in his presentation, to UNESCO and to IUCN on how to secure a more effective World Heritage Convention. So a message to UNESCO would be to learn from site-level initiatives such as Compact, also go for BioDiv, which was mentioned earlier, as a way to engage communities at every stage, and as again Harold noted, the mainstreaming or the upstreaming, not just once the World Heritage Site is declared, but from the nomination process onward to actual stewardship of the World Heritage Site, and I would add the broader landscape, and again, Compact is doing that quite effectively. Another important message that I don't see coming through necessarily yet is this point on the diversity of governance types. And Compact's experience has shown that you can engage all different kinds of governance mechanisms in a World Heritage landscape, including co-managed private protected areas as well as ICCAs. So I think the final message to UNESCO is to strengthen partnerships in order to work more effectively to reach out to partners such as Compact and to build that partnership. And priorities for IUCN, well, Tim hit them already, so I would only echo what you said, Tim, earlier. And I would certainly say that the IUCN's global membership, we've learned from Julia that it's now, what, 12,300 and counting members, that this is an opportunity to engage civil society in World Heritage. And as Tim showed us, the regional offices, the regional structure, the more capacity can be built there for World Heritage, I think the more that potential can be tapped. I did not see governance in the motion that we'll be discussing, and with IUCN so committed to the question of effective and equitable governance, I would like to see that be really implicit in the World Heritage work. And finally, just to think broader landscape, to think of World Heritage sites not as islands, but in the broader landscape, and not to leave aside connecting nature and culture. I think that divide unfortunately persists everywhere, and I think IUCN and the World Heritage Program is in an excellent position to try to bridge that divide. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Jessica, and it's wonderful to hear those examples of community engagement and real benefit flowing in this manner. Our next speaker is Gonzalo Oviedo. And Gonzalo will be well known to many people, an anthropologist, an environmentalist from Ecuador, South America, with expertise on social issues related to nature conservation, such as indigenous people and rural communities, conservation and development policy, environmental and rural education. Since 2003, he has been working as the Senior Advisor for Social Policy at IUCN headquarters in Gland, Switzerland, facilitating integration of social issues in IUCN's conservation work worldwide, with particular focus on communities, indigenous people, culture, rights and governance. So, Oviedo, sorry, Gonzalo? The wrong way around.
Thank you, Penny and Tim, for the invitation to participate in this meeting with a few thoughts about communities and rights in World Heritage. All the previous presenters have raised a number of issues that I was also planning to raise, so they have made my job much easier, particularly the examples that were shown recently, but also a few other policy topics. Now, the bottom line, of course, as we know very well, is that many World Heritage Sites in the world are inhabited by indigenous and traditional peoples and communities. All we know that very well. But the fact is also that the history of conservation, as well as the history of development, includes many examples where communities have been affected by measures implemented on the lands and on the resources that they live from. And protected areas and World Heritage Sites, they are not the exception. We know as well, fortunately, that there is growing agreement that conservation of nature should be respectful of people's rights, individual and collective rights, and that conservation, including protected areas and including World Heritage Sites, should contribute to human well-being, or at the minimum should not negatively affect human well-being. And this is growingly reflected in international environmental policies, such as the CBD, for example, and Harold made a link between World Heritage and CBD. And I would say that in that context, the CBD program of work represents an important step in recognizing issues of equity, benefit sharing, new forms of governing protected areas, and so on. So there are useful links with international environmental policy processes. And in the non-governmental conservation community, there has been also a very important shift in the way they think and practice conservation. And they growingly address topics of indigenous and community rights. And I wanted to mention, as an example, the principles of the Conservation Initiative on Human Rights, which is a consortium of the 8 major conservation organizations of the world, all of them working actively in World Heritage areas, and they have adopted these 4 major principles on rights and conservation. I won't read all of that, but basically the headings are: respect human rights, promote human rights within conservation programs, protect the vulnerable, and encourage good governance. So all these are examples that configure a new policy environment in relation to protected areas, to conservation, and more specifically as well to World Heritage. Now, as you know, the Convention has these 5 strategic objectives, these 5 C's. One of them is community participation. And based on that, state parties are encouraged to pursue partnership approaches with communities in the different phases of World Heritage establishment and management. The operational guidelines also mention the fact that traditional societies, the activities of traditional societies and local communities may be consistent with outstanding universal values and therefore should be also integrated in World Heritage Sites and recognized within them. And community management is also recognized by the operational guidelines as an adequate management form, as well as collective land tenure. But all these, I think it is insufficient, not just me. Many people think that all this is good, but is insufficient. The provisions in the convention instruments are limited regarding indigenous peoples and local communities. And that's why there is an effort going on right now by many players to try to improve these. Which is not a very easy task, as we know very well. One of the challenges is that, of course, we are dealing in World Heritage, we are dealing with the legacy of protected areas. What it means is World Heritage are established on the basis of protected areas that normally have been declared many years before the nomination of the site. And the fact is that in many cases it's at the moment of the establishment of those protected areas where the problems for the communities have been created. as an example, in the Thailand wildlife sanctuaries that became World Heritage Sites some time ago. The regional sanctuaries were established by the government 17 years before the nomination of the site, and it was 17 years before the nomination of the site when the current communities were evicted from the lands that they had traditionally occupied. And of course, the nomination of the site doesn't correct this problem. In the case of Lake Bogoria in Kenya, the plight of the Indoros communities is that they were evicted from the reserve that was created 30 years before the nomination of the site. And of course, the nomination of the site does not correct the injustices that the original establishment of that protected area would have created. So we are dealing with a legacy that is not easy to correct in the current context of the World Heritage processes. Then, of course, the international visibility of the sites makes the governments very sensitive and nervous and resistant very often to recognizing that conflicts exist. And so it makes it a little more difficult to deal with that sort of situation. There is also a conflict that is seen often as an intrinsic conflict between OUV, outstanding universal values, and the local values and the local issues of the communities. Now, this may or may not be true. I think the very framework of OUV needs to be as well revisited under a cultural lens at some point, because some of these dichotomies may not be as they are sometimes understood to be. But there is an issue there inevitably between the local and the universal. Now, on the other hand, as it was already mentioned, World Heritage Sites are ideally placed to showcase innovation, new approaches, to lead by example in conservation. So these are places where if we achieve new ways of doing things, we can actually communicate a very powerful message to the rest of the world in terms of how to do conservation. And this is precisely some of the lessons that we have heard in the previous presentations. I wanted also to say that, ethically, outstanding universal values of World Heritage Sites embody the highest standards of human cultures and nature. At the same time, the Universal Declaration on Human Rights represents the highest ethical standards about human beings living with each other. So at some point, in some way, the universal standards about people, culture, and nature have to meet. And the opposite actually should not happen. What is the highest level for us in conservation should at the same time be the highest level for us in ethical respect for people and their rights and their desire and wishes to live in dignity. So now, what to do? What options exist? We have been discussing in IUCN the option of the avenue of taking a two-track process that, on the one hand, looks at improving the current technical processes and tools, and at the same time try to influence the policy frameworks, but building from good practice, from examples, from work on the ground, from the good lessons, as it has been already suggested. It means that in moving forward on this agenda, we need to focus perhaps more on national implementation than on international frameworks, because a lot of the changes inevitably depend on the national context, on the will of stakeholders at a national level, on the capacity of the national stakeholders to move things forward and to make things change. So a greater focus on more inclusive approaches at the national level is quite important. Partner, of course, with key governments to implement and test tools and approaches. There are many governments interested in testing and trying and exploring how new approaches for more inclusive World Heritage management can happen. So we should be working with them precisely to distill best practice and good lessons, as well as with key indigenous and community organizations, many of which are already in one way or another involved in processes related to World Heritage. With institutions, and of course I wanted to mention here the need to engage in constructive collaboration with the United Nations Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues, who has been discussing World Heritage and indigenous people's rights for a few years already, and who should become a key stakeholder in these processes. As mentioned already, highlight the positive outcomes, the benefits of inclusive approaches, and disseminate best practice. It's a fundamental tool, build capacity of national agencies and stakeholders. And at the same time, assess the legal frameworks and tools in World Heritage internationally and also nationally to identify the needs and the opportunities for policy change. So working on the one hand on the practical level, on the technical tools, on improving the way we do things currently within the existing mandates of IUCN, of UNESCO, ICOMOS and others,